Hang on. Is this all the people that are on now, or are there more?
There are about 15 people right now, 16.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I've got 12, 13.
All righty, bye.
13 pictures.
She said that she was on an hour ago and she is now signing back on. She'll call if she has a problem.
Okay. Yeah, she told me that, but I told her that she was an hour early.
Yeah,
I would call her back.
she said she thinks she knows how to get on.
Okay, thanks.
She said
Appreciate
she was slow.
Yeah. Doug, do you want us to mute ourselves while you're talking? Oh, because you're not on. You're muted.
No, I don't want
Now
you to
you're
mute.
on.
I don't want you to mute. I want you just to stay open, and then we can ask questions if you want as you go along. We'll just
Okay.
pretend like we're in the same room, okay? I mean, that's fine.
We'll just have to be quiet.
Yeah, right. If you start playing the radio real loud in the background, it's going to interfere. I mean, that's one of those
It
things.
gets confusing. Yeah, okay.
It'll be okay, I think.
I'll wait till 9:45. We got 3 minutes.
Okay, because you know, Tony, it's been okay with a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds, so I feel
Yeah.
confident that
Well,
it'll
that's
work out
because
okay with all of you, you know?
It's kind of fun, you know, because
Yeah.
people can come to this class no matter where they are.
Yeah.
And there's certain advantages to, there's Sugar Den. Oh, there she goes. I recognize that place.
Yeah, so you can unmute yourself. That's fine with me. And you know, you have to go down in the corner to do it, I think.
Yeah, you go down there and you see where the mute button is.
Yeah, you just hit it
Yeah.
and it'll take the slash out.
Yeah, no, I know. You've done a lot of this.
Well, you know, that's everyone's doing a lot of it these days. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So are people able to unmute? John, you were able to unmute, right? You just did it? Yeah. Okay.
wait, let me see. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yes,
I
sir.
have 16 now.
Right.
There's Rosemary Klein. She just joined us. And Susan just joined us.
Well, all the best people are here.
Susan just
There you
went
go.
out. No, there she is. It's a different Susan. Who's that? Connecting to,
Ew.
who's the Susan that's down
Susan
at the
Manning.
bottom there?
Oh,
Tony.
there she is.
Susan
Yeah.
Manning.
I can't see you. There you are.
Good morning.
Good morning, Dennis.
Morning.
I'm still waiting, Doug, because I've got people coming in still.
Okay.
They're just coming right in, like they're coming in
Okay.
one after another.
Let me ask just a sort of structural question. John, I'm going to be able to share my screen from here, right? Okay, good.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, we need to do that. Let me get so.
Hey, Tony, I think it is 9:45, so why don't we go ahead and,
And start.
yeah, I'm gonna ask everybody except Tony and Doug to go ahead and mute yourselves. Most of you are already.
Doug doesn't want us to mute ourselves.
Oh,
That's okay.
He wants us to be able to ask questions at any time.
okay, sorry, I wasn't paying
And
attention.
he said
Oh, that's
that,
all right.
he said that if the 18 to 22-year-olds could do it, we could do it.
All right.
So let me, do you want to say anything, John?
No, I'm glad to see you all again. I saw a lot of you over the summer. I'm gonna just brag
I
on,
don't have my picture.
I'm gonna brag on you a little bit, for a second.
Well, I've lost my picture.
We can change the name.
I'm
getting ready to leave.
over the summer, Glenette Papovich is
My whole thing has gone out.
of our adult education.
See you.
Tony, you're still on. We can see you though.
We can see you, Tony.
I can't say, I just have a big
Okay,
Zoom.
but, we can see you. So hold on for 1 second.
Okay,
And so Glenette asked us to do some statistics about who, the number of views that are being happened during adult education over the summer. And for our Speaking of Faith series, that I know the Cliftons who are on participated in, that we had close to 1,000 people between Zoom and YouTube Live for an August Sunday school class. I think that may be a record for DCPC or maybe any Sunday school class. So, so thank you very much. Tony, you want to go ahead and introduce Doug?
I can't, I can't, I don't have a picture. You turned
I'm
my
not sure-
picture off when you
I'm not
started
sure
to
if you can
speak.
come on. We can see you though.
Well, that doesn't do me any good. I mean, I can't see anybody,
All right, I don't know what to do to help you right now on that.
but you just turned my picture off. Everything was fine until you started to talk. And I don't know what to do.
All right, Tony, I don't know what,
You're just gonna have to go ahead without me.
okay, can you go ahead and introduce Doug though? We can see you.
Hang on. Hello?
All right, so,
Tony, everybody can hear you.
Well, I can't, I know, okay.
this
Doesn't
is,
be any good.
so this is,
Tony, look and see if you have hit
All
stop
right.
video.
we're just gonna let Tony go. Doug Ottati is a professor of religion at Davidson College. When I first knew Doug, he was at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond. Doug is married to Pam, who is a preschool teacher. And I was not prepared, so I don't know anything. I don't know if they have kids. Doug, do you have kids?
Yeah, we got 2 of them, but there's no reason to go in all the gory details. It'll be okay.
All right, thank
now-
you.
Okay, look, I'm pleased to be here and I'm happy that you're all here. I know this is an unusual circumstance. It's the kind of circumstance that, well, we still have possibilities in it. It does demonstrate that people can neither anticipate nor control all relevant outcomes, which is a major theological point. I'd like you to keep that in mind when you're thinking about your fellow human beings, your fellow communities, institutions, leadership, and so forth. Nobody controls everything. Nobody anticipates everything. That's part of what it means to be a creature. Now, you can be smart enough to see some of it coming, but you really can't control the whole thing. Okay, another thing I think we might just say here is that we can all be thankful for having the electronic capabilities to meet. You can imagine what this would be like if we didn't have the electronic capabilities. We would just be more or less out of luck. I suppose we could meet in a giant field somewhere way far apart and try that, but that would be about our only option. So we can be thankful for the technology. I think the other thing that's true is that the technology can sometimes run into glitches. It's not really quite the same as being in the same room. There are a lot of problems with the technology, but overall, you know, thank goodness for a little bit of technology here. Otherwise, we're out of luck. So that's a pretty good deal. All right, so we're just going to go ahead and have a class, and we can have it, I think, pretty much as we always do. One of the things that's nice about this is you see everyone's name. This is a real blessing for an instructor, I can tell you that. So you have 30 kids in a room or something like that, and the administration tells me I'm not only supposed to know their names, I'm supposed to know their preferred names. Now, the chances of this happening, I don't want to tell you a big secret here, are slim to none, right? I mean, so I'm glad when the names are up there, and that's a really good deal. Okay, and we're going to talk about this time and the next 3 times. We're going to talk about John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is a book that currently now it goes into 2 volumes. And it went through 21 editions from 1536 to 1562 or so, or 4. And they stopped, the editions stopped being modified in 1559. It went through 11 French editions and 10 Latin editions. He worked on this thing just about his entire adult life. It does turn out in the end to be his premier theological statement, and it works together with his commentaries. John Calvin commented on every book of the Bible except the book of Revelation. Now that may show a little wisdom on his part, I don't know, but in any case, he didn't get to that one. And he also wrote this more or less systematic theology or general interpretation of Christian believing to go together with his commentaries. And as it ended up being a textbook at the College of Geneva for candidates in sacred theology or candidates for ministry. Didn't start out that way. So we're going to talk about a little bit in general about the Reformation, a little bit about John Calvin, and a little bit about this book today. Next time, we're going to talk over the theme of creation in the Institutes. The time after that, the theme of redemption. And we're going to end with a section on civil government. It turns out that there never was an edition of the Institutes without a chapter on civil government. And we're going to go through that a little bit, and we're going to talk about why there was never an edition without a chapter on civil government. Okay, so you've got an outline, I think, that John sent around, and we'll look at that. At a certain point, I'm going to share the screen today to show you just portraits of our cast of characters and talk about them a little bit. And that's how we'll proceed for today. How are we doing? Are we okay? Everyone can hear and stuff? We're okay? All right, good. Well, first, let's just talk about the Protestant Reformation in 16th century Europe. First thing we want to do is make a couple of comments about medieval Catholicism. These are going to be terribly general, but we can fill them out if need be with question and answer and discussion. Medieval Catholicism, the big thing you want to understand there, I think, is that it was integral to the cultures, educational institutions, and political structures of medieval Europe. That is, you could not pull them apart. For instance, suppose you wanted to talk about educational institutions in medieval Europe at different times and places. What you're really talking about most of the time are monasteries, cathedral schools, that is, cathedrals that have people who teach different things and so forth, and classes, and then finally universities. But almost all of these, I mean, the universities as well, are affiliated or connected with the Roman Catholic Church. So if you wanted to ask about higher education in medieval Europe, you're really talking about something that's intertwined with Roman Catholicism. Okay, the same thing is true of a bunch of cultural practices and so forth. Feast days, holy days, the way the calendar goes is largely a function of medieval Catholicism. You know, for instance, we just celebrated Labor Day, or at least in the North they did, or however that goes. But anyway, Labor Day comes around once a year. That was instituted by Grover Cleveland in response to a bunch of labor unrest. He really didn't have much of a choice, and he did that. But in any case, that's a national holiday. There are going to be some national holidays in medieval Europe, a couple of things, but most of the holidays are feast days for saints. So the way the calendar goes is really dominated by that. The political structures are also integrated with medieval Catholicism. They tend to be hierarchical, you know, kings, princes, etc. Down you go. They are have to do with a kind of landed aristocracy and some people with troops and so forth. And they are then integrated with other sorts of hierarchical systems through the church in large part. So the church is integral to the whole thing. There were some earlier alternative movements, that is, movements alternative to what the established Roman Catholicism was trying to do. For example, there were Waldensians in Italy. Waldensians in Italy from Waldo involves open air preaching. It involves trying to put the Bible in the vernacular, things like that, and people are getting into trouble over it. Eventually, the Waldensians throw in with some of the Calvinists and become related to that, which is true to the present day. But Waldo, that's about 3 centuries earlier than this. John Wycliffe at Oxford also involves a kind of alternative to some of what's going on in Roman Catholicism with respect to translations and so forth and other things. Jan Hus at Prague, the Hussites, another alternative movement. Girolamo Savonarola at Florence, another alternative movement. These are not unusual, they are not the usual thing, but they're not incredibly far between. So there are fissures in medieval Catholicism as you go along. They are there when they occur for a variety of different reasons. They're not always immediately religious reasons. Some of them are more immediately political reasons, which then in turn are connected with the larger structures in terms of the religion and so forth. For instance, Savonarola at Florence is mostly interested in introducing a kind of democratic order within a city state. Now he gets close, he does it for a little while, and then the medieval order makes a comeback and he's gone, right? It's a little dangerous to be engaged in political and religious reform during this particular period, right, in Europe. So you will see that, but you'll notice the locations of these things. Florence, a city that had some educational institutions and also a high cultural life and is trying to become a city state, at least for a while with Savonarola. Jan Hus at Prague at a major university and so forth. Wycliffe at Oxford, again at an educational institution. So some of the places that involve unrest are associated with some of these cities and towns and educational institutions. There's some others we'll mention presently that are not so closely associated with educational institutions, although the people who are instrumental for them have training. Okay, so the first thing is medieval Catholicism is a very big deal, and it is integrated with political, educational, and cultural structures all the way around. So when you talk about the Reformation of the 16th century, you're talking about a culture-shaking event and a cultural crisis. That's very important to understand. Okay, so by fits and starts, eventually, Luther breaks with the Roman Church. He attacks certain things he thinks of as abuses. He attacks the selling of indulgences. Indulgences were things that were sold to get some people a little bit of time off or to shorten their time in purgatory. Luther thought this was really bad. He thought a number of things were really bad. He has a series of things that he thinks are not so great. He also eventually emphasizes certain theological things. The priority of the Bible or scripture over church teaching, meaning what? We're in a Sunday school class now, so we can understand church teaching. Church teaching is what the church teaches as it goes along. Now, sometimes it's not just Sunday schools. Sometimes it's statements, it's creeds, it's confessions, and other sorts of statements. Now, for the Roman Catholic position on that was that in order to understand the Bible, you had to go through proper church teaching, and proper church teaching would get this right for you. The claim here for Luther is that all conversations about the gospel should eventually be about what the Bible says, and the church teaching is secondary. So it's never an end in itself to know what the church teaching is. The church teaching is something that's supposed to get you to something more fundamental, namely the gospel. So it doesn't mean that there are no church teachings for Luther. It doesn't mean there's no tradition. Doesn't mean any of that. It does mean that when you're talking about theology and Christian faith, the big question is not what does your church teach, but what is the gospel? What your church teaches is secondary to this. Okay, so that's a major point for Luther theologically. That's sometimes called sola scriptura, scripture alone, except when you say it that way, it's a little deceptive because Luther does not mean that you should never pay attention to church tradition. He means that it's secondary. Okay, next, he's got the idea of the priesthood of all believers. This means for Luther that you have direct access in prayer to God and so forth, and you don't have to have your relationship to God mediated by a priest. The whole community has that access. Okay, that's an idea he develops. And another idea he develops is called justification by grace through faith, or sola gratia, meaning that your right relationship with God is bestowed upon you by grace. It's not something you do. It doesn't have to do with your morality. It doesn't have to do with your merits. It is a gift of grace, period. Okay? Now, there are questions about what you do after that. You respond to the gift of grace by trying to lead a faithful life. But if you're trying to be faithful, if you're trying to be moral in order to get to heaven, Martin Luther has a word for you. Stop. It's not going to work. It never works. That's not how it works. The way it works is that God gives you a break by grace alone. And then it turns out that Paul, the apostle, is entirely correct when he says, you have no reason to boast. If you are in a good relationship with God, that's God's doing, not particularly yours. No reason to boast. Okay? All right. So we have grace alone there. Now, these are things that are features of what Luther wants to say. Why does Luther's Reformation or Luther's break with the church precipitate a larger kind of set of happenings and different structures? Largely because Luther has some significant political support by this time amongst princes in Bavaria and in Germany. So they also have an interest in some political distance between themselves and the hierarchical structure of the empire. And in order to get that distance and intensify that distance, it doesn't hurt if they break from the church and its hierarchy. And so they have political reasons for thinking that Luther is a helpful guy. And Luther's lucky that they do think that, otherwise he's not likely to last very long. So there is a political backdrop to this Reformation, and it's always prominent and important. There are other wings of the Reformation. So in addition to Luther and so forth, there is what sometimes is called the left wing or the Baptist wing of the Reformation. It is represented by people such as Thomas Müntzer, Menno Simons, Peter Riedemann, a Hutterite, Menno Simons, Mennonite, Thomas Müntzer, also a left-wing community. These communities emphasize a disciplined and holy life. Everybody is supposed to follow Jesus, more or less as a monk does, except they're not in a monastery and they have a family. And this is a possibility. They, according to these teachers, they are sometimes called a believer's church, meaning that only those who profess faith in Christ are baptized. Those are the only ones who are members of the church. So, for instance, when you and I go to a baptism over at DCPC or Witness One, most of the time it's an infant baptism. That's one where everyone in the room potentially knows what's going on except for the person being baptized. Now, it turns out that not everyone in the room doesn't actually know, because most people don't know what on earth is going on with baptism, and that's okay. But potentially they all could. They're old enough to understand it. The only person in there who couldn't understand it is the kid being baptized. That is not going to happen in the left-wing Reformation churches. In order to be baptized, you will have to profess faith first. So they favor what you call adult baptism, right? and you baptize adults. The other thing that was true is that polemically over against, they were criticized partly by being called Anabaptists. That's what Reformed and Lutherans and Catholics called them, meaning that they baptized again. So you're not supposed to ever but baptize once in strict Roman Catholicism and also in Calvinism and Lutheranism and so forth. You get baptized once, grace of God is sufficient, that's it, see you later. And it doesn't really quite matter who does it, because the efficacy of the baptism doesn't depend on whether or not the minister or the priest who baptizes you is a moral person or knows their theology right or so forth. And you can understand in these latter days why that's an important point. If you pay attention to certain clergy abuse scandals and stuff like that, you get baptized by someone who ends up being, not so great on some stuff, the baptism still holds. Okay, so the idea is you should be baptized once, but Anabaptists baptize again. Why? Because they want to be sure that someone has a strong faith personal commitment. Okay. So that's why they baptize the adults. All right. So we have the Anabaptist wing. It's sometimes called the Believers Church wing. The only people who are baptized in the church are people who profess faith and commit themselves to following Jesus. This wing, the left wing, is sometimes also involved in political things of different peasants' revolts and things of that sort. Some of them are associated with the cities and towns, some of them in more rural areas. Thomas Müntzer himself ends up not lasting particularly a long time because he leads a bunch of peasants up against some princes' armies, trained armies, and that doesn't turn out well. And you can see, they have banners with religious slogans and so forth. So we learned something there. When you go into battle, bring something more than religious slogans with you. But okay, so there you have this kind of a problem. So that's the left wing, and it's an important wing of the Reformation. Sometimes later on develops into a pacifist wing, but that takes a little time for it to happen. But for Peter Riedman, of course, it is a pacifist wing for Hutterites. So that's a Lutheranism, left wing, and then we get to Reformed Protestantism, which is just a technical term, and all it basically means from our point of view is that you're trying to reform the entire church, and you're not Lutheran and you're not left wing. You're something else. Okay, so what is the something else? The something else has to do with figures like John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, Heinrich Bullinger, Martin Butzer. A lot of them end up being ministers in Swiss cantons. Now, what's the significance of a Swiss canton for these purposes? In broad strokes, three things basically. One, they are cities, or at least what passes for cities at the time. And they have a concentration of population and some industry and so forth, winemaking and bookbinding, for example, in Geneva. And they have a central area. That's one. Second, they are way up there in Switzerland. It's hard to get to them. So if I am a prince, say that, or I'm the Duke of Savoy, and my idea is I'm going to control these city-states up there, I somehow have to deliver armies into the mountains of Switzerland. That's not an easy thing to do. That's tougher than delivering armies to Vermont. And as we know, people already refer to the People's Republic of Vermont. It's kind of out of the way. But when you start talking about Switzerland and those mountains, it's really tough. And next, what happens is that these city-states have their own relatively independent economies, and they have gotten big political ideas. Their big political ideas are that they have an emerging mercantile class, and they want to be independent of certain aspects of the Holy Roman Empire. And so Geneva and some of these other places have already put armies into the field to defeat some of the forces of the Duke of Savoy. So Geneva is a relatively independent city-state. So is Zurich. So is Bern. They all are. So, this is part of the political backdrop here for the Reformation. Now, what's going to happen is the Reformed wing with Calvin and these others is going to do pretty well in Switzerland. It's going to do pretty well in what is now Switzerland and these towns. First, because they are broken with Roman Catholicism and the Holy Roman Empire. Second, also because there are a lot of French refugees that pour into these areas. Calvin is one of them. So they pour in there if they are Protestant, if they're loyal to the cause of the Reform, they can get in trouble in France, and so they leave and they go to Switzerland. I mean, you know, that they could leave and all go to Germany, but everyone speaks German there, and there are other problems. Their preferred route is Switzerland. It's a little bit like refugees today. Where do people end up? They go next door. Okay, so that's what you've got going on there. So we have the Reformed wing. The Reformed wing, like Luther, emphasizes the priority of grace and the priority of Scripture, but it also tries to pay attention to law and a disciplined life, more or less. Now, it combines them in certain ways. Sometimes people think this wing of Protestantism is simply a hybrid of Lutheranism, grace alone, and Anabaptist or Believers Church, you better be a true disciple, buddy. And sometimes they think it's a third thing that's able to combine grace and law in different ways. But those are different judgments made about it. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Protestant Reformation in Europe. We've got a number of parties, Roman Catholicism, and that's kind of varied. And then we have Lutheran Party, left-wing party, Reformed Party. The Reformed Party, mostly in Switzerland, but then it has missionaries and groups that it's affiliated with in other places in Europe. And then, of course, eventually also in Scotland and in England. Okay, Calvin then ends up being someone who's part of the Reformed wing. He is probably the single most important reformer in the Reformed wing, but he's not the original, and he's not the only one. So you will notice, for instance, when we talk about Reformed tradition, it's not named after just one person. Now, if you talk Calvinism, I suppose you can, but Lutheranism, that's about it. And you'd say a Lutheran church is a Lutheran church. Reformed churches are not Calvin churches, they got other names. So the Reformed movement is a little plural right from the beginning, huh? It doesn't have just one leader, though Calvin is prominent. It's got some of these other leaders. Berlix Zwingli is active before Calvin is. William Farel is active before Calvin is. And these leaders are doing different things. They are all theologically inclined. They all also read a bunch of humanists at the time, and we're going to talk about that momentarily. But some of them are involved directly in military campaigns. Zwingli is involved in a military campaign. He's going to be killed on the field of battle, running up against certain forces of the Duke of Savoy and others. So you're going to have that there with Zwingli. Calvin is a second generation reformer. He's influenced by Martin Luther, and he's also influenced by Renaissance humanism, both things. Luther was a monk, and Luther was a Bible scholar primarily. Calvin was never a monk. Calvin was never a priest. Calvin studied law and philosophy and humanist studies, and he becomes loyal to the cause of the Reform. And he's French. And being French, he is more likely to be humanist than Luther in his environment. So Luther is an influence, humanism is an influence. Incidentally, with respect to ordination, then you see, Luther was ordained to a position in the Roman Catholic Church. Erasmus was, and so forth. Calvin never was. In fact, it's not entirely clear that Calvin was ever ordained at all. But this is another matter, and we don't have to worry about it now. He nevertheless apparently was able to perform and get along. It's just one of those things. All right, but you have things are a little bit fluid at the time. Calvin was born in 1509 in France. Luther was by that time about 25 years old. You have a second generation here. Erasmus, a Roman Catholic humanist, and Luther were both former Roman Catholic clerics. Calvin, as we've said, never receives Roman Catholic ordination. One commentator calls Calvin, quote, a prodigal son of humanism. And that's probably an accurate thing to say. He is very impressed by humanist currents in scholarship and in philosophy, and he is trying to work those together with a kind of Protestantism. He's also influenced by Luther. He turns to the cause of the reform in the late 1520s or the early 1530s. You can't say he was converted. I mean, he was Christian before and he's Christian afterwards. It's not a conversion. People don't have a conversion from Presbyterianism to being Baptist. They just, I don't know, change or something, right? We wouldn't call it that. And so what we have here is someone who grows up in a Roman Catholic environment and culture, who gets influenced by certain intellectual currents having to do with humanism, which we'll talk about in a moment, and Luther, and who commits himself to the cause of reforming the church sometime in the late 1520s, early 1530s. His first published work, and we're not sure whether he's done it before or after turning to the cause of the reform, because we're not sure exactly when that is. His first published work is a commentary on the Silver Age Latin Stoic philosopher Seneca, on Seneca's book De Clementia. That is, what you got on your hands here is a humanist scholar. He's interested in commenting on ancient philosophical texts, and he publishes that. He remains interested in Stoic philosophy and ethics and philosophical ethics for his entire career. And you can walk through the institutes of the Christian religion and just point to the number of places where there are references to philosophers and Stoics that are favorable. We'll mention a couple of these as we go along, but when Calvin comments on the Lord's Prayer, for example, his first reference to a thinker is to Plato, and it's positive. I just want you to think about that for a second. John Calvin commenting on the Lord's Prayer in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, the first thinker, other than biblical reference, that he makes in that section is to Plato. Plato, because Plato quotes what was thought to be the best prayer, and Calvin thinks it's a good prayer, and he quotes it down there at the bottom. This is the kind of guy into whose hands you have fallen here. It's a little different than Luther. It's a little different than other things. He simply couldn't have known that in these latter days, there would be a bunch of people who call themselves Calvinists who want to reject whole swatches of learning. That is not who you're dealing with here. That's a departure from what you've got in Calvin, and that's easy to argue. Okay, so what we've got here then is a second generation reformer. When he turns to the cause of the reform, he emigrates to Basel in 1534. That is, he's now a refugee. He's out of there. He starts working on this thing. He's been writing this thing, the Institutes, and it's a movement book, and it's clearly aligned with the cause of the reform. And he's been hanging around with people who are aligned with the cause of the reform, and that's dangerous business in France. So now he's refugee, and he goes to Basel. He goes there to continue his scholarship. That's what he's primarily interested in. He doesn't go there primarily in order to preach or to be a minister. He wants to keep reading and writing. This is the kind of guy you got here. Okay, so now he's at Basel. The first edition of the Institutes is published in 1536. It is a movement book. It fits into your coat pocket, and it's in Latin. So what we've got is we've got a movement book for the educated. We know it's for the educated because it's in Latin, international language, and it essentially amounts to commentary on the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, and the Lord's Prayer with something on civil government. That is, it's a commentary on the elements of catechism, the Creed, the Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, with something about civil government on the end. And he's going to keep working on this structure as he goes along for over 20 years. Okay, so the first edition of the Institute's published in 1536. He, in that same year, is enlisted in the cause of the Reform in Geneva by William Farel, who is already there overseeing the Reformation in Geneva. So by the time Calvin gets to Geneva, Geneva is already enlisted in the cause of the Reform. Calvin does not turn Geneva to the Reform, it's already there. And Farel is the one who gets him to stay. The idea is that Calvin is going through Geneva and he's passing through incognito, right? I mean, probably doesn't have a mask on, but he's not telling people who he is. Why is he traveling incognito? Because he had a little bit of trouble with certain authorities at certain points. So he's traveling through Geneva, and Farel knows he's there because they have to stay somewhere, and they're staying with people that know each other. And Farel has a glass of wine with him and tells Calvin that if the cause of the Reform fails in Geneva, it's going to be on Calvin's head because Calvin needs to stay here and help him with it. And this appeal, and one assumes with some other sort of more flattering remarks too, is enough to get Calvin to go to Geneva. So Calvin goes to Geneva and is there. Calvin is in Geneva working with William Farel, and then he gets in trouble over a controversy having to do with discipline and the Lord's Supper, whether or not everyone can take the Lord's Supper because of the way they've been behaving. And both he and Farel are they are turned out from Geneva. Okay, so he is turned out, and when he's turned out, he returns to Basel and then goes to Strasbourg as the pastor of French-speaking refugees. So what's going on here in part is Calvin is French-speaking, and he is French. And an awful lot of the religious leadership of the Reform that's going into Switzerland is French speaking, but an awful lot of the residents of Geneva are German speaking, and they don't always get along. Calvin's political fortunes in Geneva are you can track them directly to the percentage of the population that's French speaking or German speaking over time. Calvin does not become a citizen of Geneva until 1559. And that's sort of like a recognition of his contribution to the place just in time. He's going to be dead in a few years. I mean, he's been there for a long time. So what you want to understand also is Calvin is a French-speaking refugee, and when he gets turned out from Geneva, the next thing you know is he is pastor in Strasbourg to French-speaking refugees, where he can also keep reading and writing. That's what he's doing. Okay, so now he does that. He marries Idelette de Boré in 1540 and returns to Geneva, and Idelette dies in 1549. This is his one marriage. They don't have any child that survives infancy, and that's that. She is being married for the second time. She was married to someone who was associated with the left wing of the Reformation. She was married to a preacher, an Anabaptist preacher. Okay, but he died. So, okay, we're just running through here very, very quickly. In 1551, Calvin prepares heresy charges against Michael Servetus, who was teaching that the Trinity was a problematic doctrine. You have to say that's not an unintelligent thing to say. But in any case, Michael Servetus is claiming that, and he's in trouble all over Europe. No one likes it, right? None of the established authorities. So he decides he wants to go to Geneva because he thinks Calvin is a little shaky on the Trinity too, and maybe he'll have a better shot there. Calvin is embarrassed by this and so forth. And then what happens at Geneva is that Calvin prepares the charges in a civil suit that has to do with heresy, which he could do in Geneva. And Calvin prepares the charges, and then Calvin holds out for having him hung rather than burned at the stake, because at the time, hanging, pretty quick. Burning at the stake takes a long time, and so hanging thought to be the more humane method of execution. So there you are for Calvin and Servetus. It's probably also true that Servetus would have been hung or burned at the stake a lot of places, but he sure didn't make it through Geneva, and you can see that here. This is not exactly the high water mark of great things that happened in Geneva with Calvin, but there it is. Okay, then in 1559 at Geneva, the College of Geneva reopens. Calvin has worked on it to upgrade it and so forth. He has Theodore Beza there as the head rector for the college. And in that same year, we get the definitive Latin edition of the Institutes to be used as a textbook for ministerial candidates at the College of Geneva. So the Institutes has grown from a book that you could fit in your coat pocket. It's grown into this, see? 2 volumes, 1,520 pages long and all that sort of business and translation there. So it is now a textbook and it's this big long thing. It also is published with wide folio margins so that you can make notes in it as a student and things of that sort. So what we have now is a textbook, and here are the parts of the textbook. It's book 1 is called Knowledge of God the Creator. We'll talk about that next time. Book 2 is Knowledge of God the Redeemer in Christ under the law and in the gospel. So there's knowledge of God the Redeemer, both in the Hebrew scriptures and in Judaism under law and under the gospel. And both of those are knowledge of God the Redeemer in Christ. Calvin does not think that Jews had no knowledge of God the Redeemer. He thinks they did. And he thinks that there are Jews who belong to the one covenant of grace. In fact, it's a little bit of an open question in Calvinism as it proceeds as to whether or not you should even have missions to the Jews, because what's the point? They're already members of the covenant of grace. So this is Calvin on that stuff. Christians are engrafted onto the covenant of grace. And so they want to make sure they understand the covenant of grace remains from Abraham forward, and in some cases they want to claim from Adam forward. So that's book number 2, Knowledge of God the Redeemer in Christ under the law and in the gospel. Book 3 continues with Knowledge of God the Redeemer, how we receive knowledge of God the Redeemer, that is by faith and the effects that follow from it. Book 4 is Knowledge of God the Redeemer in Christ and has to do with external helps by which we are invited into the society of Christ and held there. Okay, so the first one has to do with law and gospel, this book 2. Book 3 has to do with how we receive it. It's by faith and the effects that follow. And then book 4 has to do with external helps, namely the church and civil government. 2 external helps, church and civil government, to hold you into the society of Christ. And we'll talk about that as we proceed. So that's a little bit about Calvin and about general background on the institutes, and we'll go a little further now with Calvin, but let's just pause there for a second. Any questions or observations about this stuff so far? It's pretty straightforward. Got a 2nd generation reformer here, but we doing okay? I think potentially the surprising thing for many people, though perhaps not for people here, is the extent to which he is influenced by humanism, and we're going to talk some more about that here.
Where does the Moravian Church fit in?
The Moravian Church is a little later, has to do with Count Zinzendorf and some others. It's related to, it's Protestant, and it's related to the left wing of the Reformation, but it is a little later. And it's, it never becomes all that big. I mean, they're noted to this day for music, right? And also good baking and things like that. They're a great tradition, sometimes very closely associated with Lutheranism, but they're a little later. And Count Zinzendorf is the guy for that. Also, later than Luther again. How are we doing? Any other things on this? All right, let's go into Calvin as a humanist, which will be important for understanding the book we're going to be looking at. He's steeped in French culture, studies humanities and law. Like Ulrich Zwingli, Butzer, and others, he's influenced by Erasmus of Rotterdam, Jacques Lefebvre, Melior Volmar, who is a Lutheran. All of these characters are interested in translating the Bible, and they're also interested in good quality manuscripts in the Greek, same like that. So Erasmus is the major figure here, and Erasmus published a Greek edition of the New Testament at a certain point. This was rejected by the theology faculty at the University of Paris because if you knew the Greek and you went to Erasmus's Greek New Testament, you could criticize the dominant translation of the Bible in Latin, the Vulgate, and they didn't like that. Now you see what's happened here. If you're a Protestant and you think you want to go back behind medieval glosses to get to original manuscripts, Erasmus is your friend. Erasmus is the guy who is one of the guys who wants to do that. He wants to do that with Cicero. He wants to do that with a number of Silver Age Latin philosophers, including Seneca, and he wants to do that with the New Testament, and so does Calvin. So one of the big things you want to see that's an intersection of the humanists and the cause of the reform is the interest in good quality manuscripts of ancient texts in their original languages. Now, I was talking with Pam about this, I don't know why, on the porch the other day. We're having a cup of coffee. I think she was asking me what we're going to do in this class. And one of the things I realized partway through that she wasn't real clear on is, you can't go back and get too many you can't get the original copies of most of this stuff, right? It doesn't exist. So if you're asking about the original copies of, like, I don't know, Plato's Republic, good luck to you. You've got other copies that have been made. If you're asking about an original copy of some New Testament book, you've got a problem on your hands. They don't exist, right? So people write these things up and then they get copied, right? There's no printing press. They get copied over time by a bunch of different people in different places. And then there are notes made in the margins. Like you're reading a book and you want to keep a note. People read it, put a note in the margin. Sometimes some of the notes in the margins migrate into the text. That's happened apparently with some of the Gospels, in particular with some of the stuff in Mark and so forth. Okay, so what you want to understand is there's no sort of vault back there with all the original classical texts, and you just unlock it, boom, you're in there and you know what the originals were. What you've got to do is compare a bunch of early manuscripts and see how they vary and figure out what looks like the best reading. So when you do that with the New Testament, you get a very complicated thing. Over here somewhere, I don't know where it is, that I've got a Nestle Almond New Testament. And those of you who have studied Greek New Testament stuff will have those sorts of things. It goes on for a long time. It's got all these notes and variations of reading all the way through in the Greek. Okay, Erasmus put together one of those things. It's not as detailed as later ones, but he did it. And for his troubles, it was rejected by the theological faculty at the University of Paris because it undercut the translation that was then available. But what you do want to see is that this participates in a broad humanist strategy for scholarship. You want to read Cicero, you want to read Plato, you want to try and get a reliable manuscript and not just the first one that gets stuck in front of you. And you want to try and do it in the original languages. And this requires two things. It requires some historical work to try and figure out what the manuscript ought to be. And it requires, second, that you learn the language that the manuscript is in. Those are humanist ideas. And what Calvin is going to do when he turns to the Bible, basically, is apply humanist ideas to the New Testament. He wants a good edition of the New Testament in Greek, and he wants you to be able to read it in Greek. And the same thing's going to happen with Hebrew scriptures and Hebrew. So to this day, in Presbyterian seminaries, it is at least offered. It's not any longer required at most of them. That's another discussion. That candidates learn some Greek and Hebrew so that when they're preparing their sermons, they can, if they need to, go back to an original text and see what's going on. but that's a humanist idea that turns out to be a Calvinist Reformed idea. Okay. And so we have a number of things going on there. Now, what I want to do now is I want to just share the screen with you for a second to show you our cast of characters. With any luck, this is going to work. I'm going to hit a button and you're going to see some other stuff. I'm going to ask you whether you see it.
There we go. Good.
How are we doing? Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. This is a portrait of Erasmus of Rotterdam by Hans Holbein, 1523. There's a little Latin couplet on the book that says Holbein would rather have a slanderer than an imitator, presumably for a friend or an acquaintance. So here is the great humanist scholar. This particular portrait was done, this is like a publicity photograph, only it's a portrait, okay? Because you can't have a photo. Erasmus, by this time, is very, very famous scholar, and he is internationally known. So he has a series of portraits of himself done, and he sends them to places. This one was sent to England and is in an English museum. But there is a portrait of the great scholar as he would prefer to have been thought of. This is a publicity photo. It's a publicity portrait is what it is. Okay, that's one. Now here's Ulrich Zwingli, who dies on the field of battle in 1531. This is an oil portrait done of him in 1531. You know, he's being fondly remembered at that point. And he is one of the reformers in Switzerland, and he preached from Erasmus's Greek New Testament, which is itself a kind of act of defiance to do. Okay. Here is an engraving of Calvin at age 53, Rene Boivin, 1562. And, you know, it's hopefully something like the way he looked. He looks approximately this way, making allowances for age in different sorts of things. But this is an engraving from the time when he was around 53. And at this point, of course, he's well thought of and well known at Geneva. He is being revered. Here is a portrait of Idelette de Boré Calvin. This particular painting is by Xavier Worth, and it was done in 1909. There was an anonymous original that presumably was done while she was alive, but it was destroyed in 1940. And so what you've got is this secondary copy for a portrait of her. And then just last to show some of the big shots doing well. This is the center of the Reformation Wall at the University of Geneva in Geneva. It was done in 1909. As you're looking at it, as I'm looking at it from the left, Farel, and then the tallest one, Calvin, and then Theodore Beza, who was brought to Geneva to run the College of Geneva, and then John Knox, who studied in Geneva. So William Farel on the far left is the person that got Calvin involved in Geneva to begin with, and they are in the middle. Off to the right here, there is, among others, there is Roger Williams, off to the right, who is also claimed for the cause of the Reformed. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to try and come back here. Let's see how I do. Not sure what I've done to get us this far. Yeah, I'm going to try and get you back. Let's see how I do. Okay, we got to come this way. I think I will succeed momentarily with stop share. Good, we're back.
Good.
Okay, so that's just a little picture show. We'll try and have them. Look, all my lectures now over at the school have picture shows because, you know, you're going to be on a screen like this. You don't want people to get too bored too quickly, and we got to come up with something. So there we go. and not that easy to do when it comes to something like, you're going to do 4 sessions on a book. Good luck for that. What are the interesting pictures? We got slides of the book, right? Okay, so just to continue then, what we've got is Calvin is someone who's influenced by humanists. He appreciates philosophical ethics and so forth and natural law. I already mentioned that when he comments on the Lord's Prayer, his first reference to a thinker is to Plato, and that's sort of significant. He also has in the Institutes a section of chapter 2 of book 2 called Science as God's Gift. And if you get a chance to look at it sometime, you ought to look at it. He wants to tell you that you should honor the truth wherever it is found, because the Spirit of God is the source of all truth. And if you do not honor the truth wherever it is found, including in classical writers, classical philosophers, humanists, and secular writers, if you do not honor it, you are contending against the Spirit of God. That's a bad idea according to Calvin. So he's not only friendly to looking at some of this stuff, he thinks that if you don't, and if you quit looking at multiple sources of truth, you are in trouble. That's what this guy thinks. And he's going to tell you that right here. He is very interested in a liberal arts education that includes all of these sorts of inquiries and disciplines. He could not know that in these latter days, there would be some few sullen minds in Virginia Beach and in Lynchburg who would associate Protestantism with not looking at this stuff. You want to reject secular writers? Go ahead. But being a Calvinist is not a real promising move if that's what you want to do. All right, so we've got that there. It's a beautiful section there, actually. Now, what we want to talk a little bit is about Calvin's substantive position in the Institutes. He talks about what he calls his Christian philosophy. The first thing that in one of the prefaces to a French edition, and one of the things you want to notice about that is that the term is itself a humanist term, calling it a Christian philosophy. He is interested in what is truly human, which is another feature of humanism. They want to know what it is that's truly human about human beings and how that works. If you recall an ancient dictum from Greek philosophy, it might be, know thyself, right? Why is know thyself an important dictum? It's a practical dictum in a way. You and I are going to go around and be a whole bunch of different situations in our lifetime. And those situations will vary from place to place and time to time. But one thing will always be there, you and me. So if you know yourself, that is a leg up on trying to figure out how to behave practically in a world. Know yourself, your possibilities, your limits, and your nature. So that's what this dictum really means. Now let's just consider the first sentences of Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. The guy worked on them for like over 33 years. So they're likely to be sentences that he took some care in putting together, right? And here we are. Nearly all the wisdom we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of 2 parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. But while joined by many bonds, which one precedes and brings forth the other is difficult to know or discern. Now, all the wisdom we possess, knowledge of God and of ourselves. Calvin is very aware of the dictum, know thyself. And what he's done here is giving you his theological equivalent in his Christian philosophy. Know God, know yourself. If you want to know yourself truly, you need to know yourself in relation to God. If you want to know God truly, you need to know God in relation to yourself. Relational theology and a humanist theology. So he wants to say that. The other way we can talk about Calvin as a kind of humanist and Renaissance thinker of sorts is that he is in favor of a worldly faithfulness. You're supposed to be faithful to God in the world. And this is one of the reasons why he always has a segment on civil government and the institutes. There are other reasons for that too. There's some other things on the outline there. I think they're pretty much self-explanatory. The only other one that isn't is the stuff on Luther, and we can talk about that next time if you like, or we can talk about it now. But let me just stop there. How are we doing?
We got 10:45.
Okay,
So
so
we
we'll,
probably need to let people
good,
get up and get ready to go to the 11 o'clock service.
good. Okay, so we'll stop there, and next time if you want, we can start with Luther on leaving the monastery and Hans washing dirty diapers. It will be a portrait. It will be a portrait in worldly faithfulness, washing dirty.
Doug, that was great. You did a beautiful job.
Oh,
Because,
well, we'll return to the stuff. We got plenty of time.
yeah, that's great. I
Okay,
really
good to
enjoyed it.
see all of
Thank
you.
so much.
Hope things go well, huh?
Thank
Yeah.
you, Doug. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Really nicely done.